Welcome back. In this video, I want to talk about functions. Functions are extremely useful in programming when it comes time to organize your code. And you will see functions used everywhere. In fact, in HaxeFlixel, you will see two functions right here, create and update. These are functions. To create a function, you write the word function, followed by the name of the function. I'm going to say greet, followed by brackets, and then you add braces. And inside this function, I'm just going to trace hello. Now to call this function, I simply need to type the name of the function, followed by the brackets, followed by a semicolon. That's it. Once you run that, it prints hello in the console. So basically what's going on is you start the program, you call greet, and the program will find where the function greet is and run this code. After the program finishes, it goes back to where you run the function and continues. So just as another example, I'm going to trace finish after the function call. And in the console, you'll see hello first, followed by finish. And that's because the function is being called, which calls hello, and then it comes back and prints finish. Like I said before, create and update are functions called by HaxeFlixel. But we will talk about that next video, because create and update are functions that are tied to the FLX class, which we haven't covered yet. I'm going to create a new function, and we're going to call this add numbers. It's going to take two arguments, num1, which is an int, and num2, which is also an int. And inside this function, we're going to trace num1 plus num2. And then to call the function, I'm going to call add numbers 1 and 2. Arguments basically let you give values to functions. In this case, we're giving the numbers 1 and 2 to the add numbers function, so that add numbers can then add these two numbers together. So when we call add numbers, we give it the values of 1 and 2. 1 goes to num1. So these values are placed in order, by the way. So you have 1 in num1, and you have 2 in num2. And then when you trace this, it takes the value of num1, which is 1, and add num2 to it, which is 2. We'll run that. And obviously, you get 3. Just really quick. Sometimes you will hear arguments being called parameters. They basically mean the same thing, so don't worry about it. These arguments have data types. They're both int, which means this function can only contain numbers. So if I tried to type in word here, you would get an error, because you can't pass a string into an int. And one more thing about arguments, you can set a default value. So if you wanted to, you could say that num2 is always going to be 2 by default, which means if you just get rid of the 2, it doesn't really matter what you put in num2 because it's going to be 2 by default. So you can give the function the first parameter and then ignore the second argument. But if the second argument is ignored, it uses 2 instead of throwing an error. But you can still override this argument by typing in a different value. And then we get 6. So you don't have to pass a value in here, but if you do, it overrides what is already there. Now let's talk about return values. Before you can make a return value, you need a data type for this return value. So I'm just going to add a colon. At the end, we're going to use int. And instead of tracing num1 plus num2, we're going to return it. So what this is doing is at the very end of the function, we add num1 plus num2, and then we return the value, which means when the function returns to where it was called, the value can now be used here. So as an example, I'm going to create a variable called thing and set it to the return value of add numbers. If we trace that, you get 6. So we're not tracing anything in add numbers. We are simply running through this code. Once we get to this line, it will call add numbers. It will pass in 1 and 5. It will add the two numbers together and then send that result, send the sum of those two values back through to where it was called and store it in the variable. And then it prints the variable. The next thing I want to cover is function scope. So if you decide to, like for example, if we take this sum and create a variable out of it instead, we'll use var sum and give it the result of that expression and then return sum. This will give the same result as before, but now we're using a variable inside a function. This variable cannot be seen outside of that function. So if we try to use sum over here, for example, we'll get an error because it doesn't know what sum is. Sum hasn't been defined anywhere inside this function. And likewise here. The only place sum is used or defined is in add numbers. So sum is only ever inside add numbers. And that is often why you use arguments and return values. If you want to create a variable in this function, but you want to use the value of that variable inside another function, you would pass that in as an argument. And now we're using number as num1 here in this argument. There is another way that you can share variables across every function, but again, that is related to classes, which we have not covered yet. All right, let's clean all this up. Challenge time. I don't have any code to give you this time. I just have a comment. That's the challenge. Basically just write a function, create a new function that takes a string as its argument, and then return the length of that string. And then print the results of that function with trace. And one more hint, because I forgot to explain it in this video, but you can get the length of a string in the same way that you can get the length of an array. This may trip you up depending on how much you'd be paying attention, but we'll see. The solution will be in the comments, and I will see you in the next video.